Thank you so much. And thank you for coming. Wow, on this gorgeous, hot summer day in Vancouver. I really appreciate you taking the time. And I have to say, I recognize every single one of you in the room, almost every single one of you. And I'm just absolutely thrilled. I've got friends here from UBC, and I've got my family here, right there in the corner, my godparents and my parents there. I've got my friends from Renfrew School in Windermere. Woohoo! People I haven't seen in 26 years. Thank you so much. I've got my editor here as well, and my church friends, and so great. This is fantastic. So thank you so much for coming. One of the main reasons why I wanted to do this was I released my book, The Same Sky in New York, and this was on February 28th. And it was such a thrilling event. But I have to say, I wanted to release my book here in Vancouver. This is my stomping ground. This is where I was born and raised. And I'm very, very proud of my heritage here. I'm very proud of this city. And so I wanted to release it here for you. And I also wanted to share the joy of traveling, which is why I've also invited some pretty well-known travel bloggers here in Vancouver. We got Henry and Jai and Adelina here, very well-known, and so they're going to be coming up and sharing some of their readings. One of the things that I wanted to really, drill home tonight is that, with traveling, it's more than just saying, oh, I did this, I did that. I think one of the nicest things about traveling is that you get to experience a new culture, people. And if you've been on a difficult journey, as I have, and that's what the book is about, it helps you heal in many ways. Around 14 years ago, I was living in Beijing. At the time, I was an expatriate. And I was living together with this French guy. And we were in love, and we were going to move to Europe one day and, and have a family. And then one day, he came home and said it was over. And it was awful. My whole world just fell apart. So I packed up my bags and I went to Tibet, Laos, and Cambodia by myself for about 3.5 months. And it was the hardest thing I ever did. But yet it was the most enlightening experience for me. And shortly after that, I got a job and I moved to New York. And when I got there, I thought, that experience was so transformational, I wanted to write about it. So that's when I started writing, at first on cocktail napkins, and then in journals, and then I joined a memoir writing class. And I started writing more and more. And what started off as a short story about how I got arrested in Tibet, yes, that's one of the stories. What started off as a short story about how I got arrested in Tibet for an expired visa turned into a longer story to what it is today, a travel memoir of my time in Tibet, Laos, and Cambodia. And the most important thing I want to share about that is that for me, the experience was more than just, oh, I've been to these places. I wanted to share in my book with anyone, woman or a man, who's been through heartbreak or any kind of calamity of the heart, that you can feel better about yourself, that you can travel and meet the most amazing people who have suffered far worse than me, and they give you the kind of peace and inspiration that maybe you wouldn't feel in any other time in your life. And that's something that's really special, and I wanted to share that with other people. And the other reason why I wrote the book was because there are some geopolitical issues that go on in Tibet and Laos and Cambodia. And I wanted to ensure that, some of those issues come through as well in my book. So now it just so happened in 2005, Eat, Pray, Love came out. I like to think my book is better than Eat, Pray, Love. But who's going to blame me in Eat, Pray, Love, right? Elizabeth Gilbert wrote a wonderful travel memoir, and I'm not going to knock it because it is a good book, and she paved the way for travel memoirs. So I'm also thankful for her as an author. I wanted to read just a couple quick passages about why we travel and what compels us to travel. And then we're going to start some readings. Somebody the other day asked me, why Tibet? Well, let me share with you what I mean about that. My first stop would be Tibet. My curiosity about this lovely place went way back. As a kid, I was an avid stamp collector, and I remember scouring the globe for this obscure place, Tibet, that didn't have its own stamps. Every other country had its own. Because they're part of China, my dad shrugged and went back to mowing the lawn, the air thick with the smell of grass and new spring. As I pulled out weeds with my small fists, I was determined to get to the bottom of it. How strange, even odder, that their leader, the Dalai Lama, with his big, thick, dark glasses and his kind, warming face that reminded me of hot soup on a rainy day, wouldn't go back to Tibet. He seemed to travel a lot, but just never went home. I learned years later that the Dalai Lama's life had been threatened, and he had fled his homeland to escape the Chinese occupation. I couldn't imagine another country invading Canada and our Prime Minister having to escape or be killed. Then I hit my teenage years and forgot about faraway countries that had no stamps and a homeless leader. And I concentrated on school, boys, and why my body was changing so much. It wasn't until after my university days that a BBC documentary about Tibet awakened my desire to travel there. As my eyes followed the procession of Tibetan monks trailing the prayer wheel circuit, I thought, I have to go there one day. Everything seemed so peaceful. The way the colorful prayer flags decorated the exterior of temples and mountain passes, like ribbons on presents. The way the saffron robes graced the creaking floors of wooden temples, while the low, soothing sounds of Tibetan trumpets echoed in the hallways. This isolated place, tucked away in the Himalayan mountains, where McDonald's and Coca-Cola hadn't penetrated, fascinated me. There would be no Starbucks in every corner, no ads constantly flashing in my face, or at least I didn't think so. I wanted to experience that seclusion, to let my fingers run down the walls of temples where only my footsteps could be heard padding up and down the stairs. My curiosity for Tibet never left me, but it would be many years before I would travel near that region. Not only was it difficult to get there, but Tibet had been closed to tourists for many years. And then there was the lure of Mount Everest, its first base camp by the border between Tibet and Nepal. Imagine standing at the foot of the highest mountain on earth. Throughout high school, I had read fascinating stories of those who succeeded and many who perished climbing to the formidable peak. The ground littered over the years with their frozen corpses. I could go anywhere after that. Thailand with its beautiful beaches, Burma with its hundreds of abandoned Buddhist temples dotting the landscape, Cambodia's Angkor Wat temples. I wanted to cruise down an unknown street and try a different concoction of food every day, to get lost in a crowd, to be nameless, to relish the transience of meeting others who didn't care about knowing my past or belonging to my future. I wanted the here and now, the freedom to be engaged in the moment. So that's just a little taste of why I wanted to go to Tibet in the first place. And there's going to be some more readings from my book, The Same Sky. But what I'd like to do now is I'd like to bring up my first speaker. And where is she? There you are. Okay, come on up, Adelina. This is Adelina. Let me tell you how I met her. I actually just met her a couple days ago. On Twitter, I started to search around on Twitter, which, by the way, is not such a scary social media tool after all. And I found Adelina, and I just loved the fact that her blog has so many wonderful posts about where she's been. She's been all over the world, and including living in Budapest. And I'm really proud of someone this young and so spirited in her journey to travel to so many places. So Adelina's going to share a little bit about herself and also her piece. Let's give it up for her.
Thanks. I'm a little bit shorter. Okay. So as Debbie alluded to, I have been traveling for many years. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. It started when I was quite young. My family, especially my father, he loved globetrotting. And as a toddler, they would bring me along and pack me into the back of the car, and we go on road trips throughout the U.S. and Canada. And that love of travel has really taken me throughout my life. So the first time I went to Europe, I was 14, and that trip really changed my life. I was determined at some point I was going to move across the world and live there for a little while just to see, what life is like on the other side of the world. Eventually I did do that after my university degree, but before that I was in Cambodia for a little while. I helped build a school there, which was again, life-changing experience just because it was such a different world, different way of life, and just the people I was able to meet was very not what I expected, I guess. Upon graduation, I knew it was time for me to go abroad. I eventually found a job. I worked for an English school in Budapest. I wasn't really teaching, I was helping bring other people to Budapest to live their dream of living abroad. So that was a really great experience because I got to meet all these people from all around the world. And today's piece, I'm going to be sharing some conversations I've had with these people around the topic of home, because it was something that I really struggled with while I was abroad during all of my travels, and it really kind of shaped the kind of traveler I am today. So these were all originally blog posts. I haven't written a memoir like Debbie, so I've kind of adapted the 3 different pieces that I written over the course of 3 years. So you can kind of understand my state of mind during the past 3 years of leaving home, of living abroad, and then eventually returning. Okay. November 17th, 2011. When you're living abroad, you meet the most interesting people and have the most interesting conversations. The other night, I was having dinner with people from all corners of the world, all of them expats, all of whom have been living in Budapest for months when the topic of home came up in conversation. One said that home is where their friends were, and since the majority of friends had left their hometown, that really wasn't home anymore. Instead, they considered Budapest to be their home, where they felt the most comfortable. This got me thinking, is home the place where you grew up, or where your family is? Is home where you feel most comfortable? Or perhaps it's where you have a job, where you see yourself in the future. Where is my home? Is it in Vancouver, where I grew up? Victoria, where I went to university? Or is it where I am now in Budapest? Vancouver is where I spent most of my life. I grew up there, lived there briefly before going abroad. I love the city dearly, especially with its glorious snow-capped mountains, multiculturalism, and openness for pretty much anything. Vancouver is familiarity, comfort, and family. Victoria is where I gained my independence, where I started on my journey of finding myself. Moving out at such a young age was probably the best decision I could have ever made. For a while, Victoria truly was home. Victoria's independence, discovery, and finding my passions. And now I'm in Budapest. This is the longest I've been away from Canada and what I have always considered to be home. For now, Budapest still feels temporary, and that home is Vancouver. I love being in Budapest, and I really like the city, but something about the city just isn't quite right. December 12th, 2012. In less than a week, I'll be on board a flight bound for Vancouver. When I think about leaving Budapest, even for this short time, I get a mixture of feelings. On one hand, I'm excited to be going back home. I've been away for so long, and I'm looking forward to seeing my family and friends, to rediscovering the city. But on the other hand, I'm utterly terrified of going. I'm afraid of the changes in the city, in my friends, and in myself. Will things be strange to me? Will I still be able to relate to my friends and to my family? How will I explain everything that I've experienced in Budapest to them? And I'm also sad. As much as the last few months have been difficult with the loss of my job and getting sick abroad, Budapest is home to me now. I have wonderful friends and great memories in this city. Most of all, I'm sad to be leaving the budding relationship I have with my Hungarian boyfriend. I adore him, but will we last a couple months of separation? More than anything, he has made this place home for me. Maybe what makes a place home is the people you know and the network of support that you build for yourself after all. November 14th, 2013. I had originally returned to Vancouver knowing that I was going back to Europe. I had a job, a place to live, and a full closet. I had a life in Budapest, but of course, sometimes life doesn't turn out the way that you want it to, and I had to stay in Vancouver for a little while longer. Eventually, I found a job, the responsible thing to do, and settled down. Now, almost a year later, I'm starting to struggle. I have this ongoing urge to pack up my life and just go, but at the same time, I don't. I'm bored with the monotony of day-to-day life, and yet the comforts of home are slowly trickling in. I'm ready for change and adventure. Can it be as simple as buying a plane ticket and going to the other side of the world? I did it 3 years ago, so why can't I do it again? I'm neither here nor there. Half of my worldly possessions are currently at my boyfriend's house on the other side of the world. Long distance relationships are hard, and the 9-hour time difference, it makes it really difficult to talk and connect. Seeing each other every 7 to 8 months just doesn't cut it. Maybe home isn't where you grew up or where your family is, but then what does make a place home? I love Vancouver for its mountains, its amazing food, and all the people. Yet, I love Budapest for who I am when I'm there. When I'm in one city, I miss the other. So where do I belong? On my Twitter profile, I list my location as both Budapest and Vancouver. Is this what the rest of my life is destined to be? Torn between two very beautiful but very different cities? For now, I consider both to be my home. While I'm currently spending more time in Vancouver, who says this won't change in the future? And I'm okay with that. Thank you.
That was really nice. Thank you. Let's put this back up. That's great. And I think we often grapple with that, right? Where's home? What does home mean to us? And actually, that's a nice segue. Very good. Nice segue into what I'm going to share, which is where is your heart when you're traveling? And I think that, as I've already shared, when I was in Tibet, in Laos and Cambodia, I was really brokenhearted and I was upset and kind of messed up. And I think during that time, I really wondered the same thing as well. Where was home and where was my heart? One of the most beautiful things about traveling is that wherever you go, you meet the kindest people and they invite you into their home. You don't even have to speak any, Cambodian or, Tibetan, and they just welcome you into their home and they're serving you tea and they give you cake and, and they don't even have that much, and yet they open their hearts and their homes to you. And those little small acts of kindness really helped me, propelled me to move forward in my journey of healing. So my reading tonight that I'm going to share is called Prayer Wheels. And it's about those small acts of kindness that along the way help me to be stronger and help me to heal from the broken heart that I was experiencing, and to also open up to just a bigger world about all the different things that are out there and being open to that. How many of you have been to Tibet? Anybody raise your hand? Okay, well, all the more to go, right? In Tibet, and you'll see this also in Nepal, they have these things called the prayer wheels. And it's these round type of barrels, and they've got these knobs. And what you do is you walk past them and you spin them. And the idea is that when they're spinning, you are praying, and your message of healing goes up to the sky. And the Tibetans believe that when you are circulating around the temple, you're sending your messages around and above you. So this takes place in Tibet, where I met some monks. I'm quite fond of monks. I think they're just lovely. At the far end of the square, I stepped into Jokang Monastery, which stood tall like a magnificent god with brilliantly colored robes that draped all along the sides with golden pillar tops. The noise from the streets dissipated except for the shuffling of feet and the prayer beads on people's wrists jingling with every motion forward. The warm flicker from the rows of candles met up to greet my face, dancing and swaying in sync with every Tibetan who would walk by. After perusing the chapel rooms, I sat cross-legged on a quiet spot on the rooftop and pulled out my Tibet travel guide to read about this temple. A burgundy scarf covered my page, except it wasn't a scarf, but part of a robe belonging to the monk leaning over me. When his walnut eyes locked with mine, he stepped back and cautiously looked around. Then he tapped my book 3 times and grinned. His face was aged with time and experience, but his expressions were childlike. When I smiled back, he blinked excitedly behind the dinner plate glasses that seemed to smother his face. Several times he turned around and scanned the corridors, his long saffron robe flowing with each movement. But nobody was there. In broken Chinese, he asked where I was from. I hesitated. Would he believe me if I told him I was from Canada, even though I looked Chinese? Canada, I said. He nodded approvingly, and his glasses slipped down below his nose. He pushed them back up with his fingers. 但是你不是中国人啊? So you aren't Chinese? I shook my head. I explained that my parents were from China, but immigrated to Canada, where I was born and raised. his head tilted to the side to get a better look at me. I opened my money belt and gave him a Canadian flag pin. He paused and let it sit on his palm. He pulled the clasp and then proudly put it on his robe. Now that we were officially friends, he grabbed my guidebook. He flipped through it as if he hadn't eaten in days, and somewhere in the pages he would find food. What was he looking for? Out of the dark doorways, a few more monks appeared until finally a circle of them was jabbering in Tibetan, like an excited sewing group. They pointed and tried to take the book away from my new friend while I looked on in confusion. A hushed silence overcame the chatter. My friend pointed at a tiny picture of the Dalai Lama. Each monk quietly took the book and lightly tapped the top of his head with the picture of their great leader. When the Dalai Lama fled Tibet in 1959, the Chinese government announced that anyone caught discussing or reading about the Dalai Lama would be subject to severe punishment. No wonder these monks were so intrigued by my book. Handing the book back to me, the monks bowed. Then, not knowing what to say next, they started to head back towards their living quarters. "Wait," I said. I didn't want them to go. The kindness in their humble gestures and the endless respect they had for their exiled leader moved me. I didn't want this experience to end. Feeling brave, I flipped to the appendix in the back titled Helpful Phrases. "What's your name?" I read out in Tibetan. My friend with the Canadian pin stepped forward and proudly said his name. One by one, my new friends introduced themselves. We practiced hello and thank you in both Tibetan and English, and each time they giggled and gave me the thumbs up sign. I graduated to more complex sentences from "I am Canadian" to "Where will you stay this evening if it rains?" They thought these were outright silly and they laughed hysterically. After we had exhausted the phrases from the guidebook, I thanked the monks for their time and gave them each a Canadian flag pin. The bravest one, a shrunken fellow with hunched shoulders, asked me if I could help him pin it to his robe. Then he added, while pointing to the layer of fabric closest to his skin, "Near my heart, please." Fits of giggles later, we said our goodbyes and they disappeared behind the wooden doors that dotted the corridors. As the sun set later that day, its warm rays beaming down on the fluttering prayer flags strung between the posts, I visited the prayer wheels that surrounded the entire temple. Hundreds of brass wheels were perched on dusty wooden racks, row after row, with polished knobs at the base you could turn when walking past. It is believed that with each spin, your prayer flies upwards to heaven. However difficult or painful this journey will be, I will survive and get to the other side. I marched forward with one foot following the next. My right hand spun the prayer wheels, which whirred away, sending my message of healing to the skies. Thank you. Thanks. I'd like to call on the next person, and her name is Jai. And I met Jai on Twitter as well. I was stalking her for a while, and I actually fell in love with her website because it's just absolutely beautiful. And it not only shows Jai's wonderful intrigue about the world, but just her beautiful writing style and pictures. And actually, Jai writes a lot about Vancouver and Victoria and, all along Vancouver Island. And the best part is she writes about food, too, which is my favorite topic. So I'm really excited to have Jai also come up here and share some of her travels. And actually, today she's going to talk about Cambodia. So let's give it up for Jai.
Sorry, a little bit louder. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thanks so much for that intro. So I was really touched by actually what Adelina said as well about the concept of home. I think that's a really interesting point that you bring up. And as an expat, sorry. Oh, is it? Yeah, down a bit.
There you go.
All right. Is that better? All right, there we go. Sorry. So I was saying I was really touched by what Adelina said about the concept of home, because you might be able to tell from my accent that I'm not originally from Vancouver. So I'm also an expat and also sort of going through the same feelings of being in one city and then missing the other and never quite knowing which one is home. So I think it's a really good point that you brought up. But Debbie has actually asked me to come to talk about Cambodia today because I've spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia. So can I just ask how many people in the room have actually been to Southeast Asia? Okay, so quite a few. And did you love it like I did too? Okay. And how many of you have actually been to Cambodia? Okay, so 3 or 4 people have been to Cambodia. So most of you haven't really been there, and I hope that what I say about it will interest you, but also encourage you to hopefully go there for yourselves. I'm just going to read you a little intro, give you a bit of context to my piece. The piece is something that is actually on my blog. I've got a travel blog, and I write about the whole world, including, as Debbie said, Vancouver. And I do write a lot about food because I think it's everyone's favourite topic. So just to start off, my name's Jailan. My travel blog is called Savoir There. And I always tell people that I'm a travel writer and I'm a travel blogger, and they ask me two questions that always come up time and time again. One, can you really make a living out of writing about travel? And I'm sorry to say the answer is pretty much no. And the second question is, what's your favourite country in the world? And my favourite country in the world, I kind of cheat in that I've got two. One of them is Italy. I've got a love affair with Italy that's gone on for over a decade. I've been there at least once a year for the last 10, 12 years. But I do have one in Southeast Asia too, and that's Cambodia. I've always found that Cambodia is a place that really draws you in. It's got a magnetic quality that I don't think anywhere else in the world really has. So what I want to talk about is just my history with Cambodia and why I fell in love with it, and give you a bit of context to what a unique place it is. So basically, I first went to Cambodia in 2005. I was on a trip through Southeast Asia, and I touched on lots of different countries. They were all wonderful. But I found that Cambodia had this way of just pulling you in and not letting you out of its grasp. I stayed in everything from luxury hotels which cost hundreds of dollars a night, down to guest houses that were like $8 a night. And funnily enough, it was the one that was the cheapest of all, and it was the dirtiest, and it was $8 a night, and I fell in love with that place. And one of the reasons I fell in love with it is because it was owned by a guy from New Zealand. He had left New Zealand to do a round the world trip. His first stop was Cambodia, and it turned out to be his last stop as well. He never got any further because he just fell in love with the place. He also fell in love with a Khmer girl. They got married, they had a family. The guest house was called Sasha's, and Sasha was a little toddler who was running around the guest house at the time. It had a real family feel to it, and it had one of those honesty bars where you just, put $1 in a jar and took a beer and just had that lovely laid-back feel. And when you're somewhere like that, why would you want to leave? I could see why he'd stayed. So then if we fast forward to a few years later, one of my best friends from London said, I'm going to go and teach English in Southeast Asia for like a year with my husband. And they said, we're going to go to Vietnam. So off they went, and they decided to just stop over in Siem Reap, which is Cambodia's kind of tourist capital, if you like, and it's the jumping off point for the temples of Angkor Wat, which are pretty famous. They got to Siem Reap, and they never left either. So 3 years later, they still live there, and they own a language school there. And they really just fell in love with the place and were pulled in by that same magnetic charm that pulled me in, and that I've heard time and time again has pulled people in. So I kind of want to talk about some of the brutal history to Cambodia. And I don't like to linger on that, but at the same time, I think because of the piece I'm going to read, we do have to maybe linger on it just a little bit. So I don't know how much you guys know about the politics of Cambodia in the 1970s, but at the time, the country was run by the Khmer Rouge, which was a ultra hardline, ultra communist, xenophobic, Marxist political party, the like of which I think really the world has never seen before. The only comparison that realistically can be made, and it's kind of simplistic really, would be with Hitler and the Nazis, I suppose. If I can give you an example, just this will tell you everything you need to know. The motto of the Khmer Rouge was, to keep you is no benefit, and to destroy you is no loss. So that was their feeling about their own people, which is pretty shocking. The idea behind the Khmer Rouge is that they wanted to bring Cambodia back to a completely agrarian society, get rid of any foreigners, any intellectuals. People were killed just for wearing glasses. It was an incredibly mind-boggling way to run a country, and it resulted in the death of about 2 million Cambodians, which is why the country is still picking up the pieces to this day, I guess. So as educated travellers, I think we all want to understand a little bit about the scars from countries that we travel to, so that we can understand where we are in the context of our trip. Even though we want to have a great holiday, I think it's good to also understand the underlying issues that make that country what it is. So you've probably heard about The Killing Fields, the movie, and I guess it's the actual real site of The Killing Fields is in Phnom Penh. So most tourists will, as a nod to the history of Cambodia, go and visit The Killing Fields and go and visit the Genocide Museum just to get a sense of what happened there. But I was, could say lucky enough, but privileged enough to go back to Cambodia for an extended period of time in 2012. And I knew people there, and I was invited to go on a trip with some charity workers to a temple, and on the way back to visit Pol Pot's house. Pol Pot was the leader of the Khmer Rouge, a pretty vilified and hated figure, and we set off to go and visit the place where he lived out his last days. So I'm just going to read you the piece about how I felt at the time, and really just talk about my visit to Pol Pot's house and what the impression it left with me. Like everyone else, I take my shoes off and leave them in the pile before entering the last place Pol Pot ever lived, out here in the northern Cambodian district of An Long Veng, nestled against the Thai border. But this small and typically Asian behavioural detail, meant as a form of respect, is going against every fibre in my body as I struggle against the urge to replace my flip-flops with a huge pair of imaginary boots and trample through a place which is already sending shivers down my spine. The site isn't much more than a few dusty outbuildings and a couple of mind-bogglingly creepy cages and 2 outside squat toilets. For the last living quarters of the Khmer Rouge commanders who decimated an entire country, there's little quantifiable here to actually see, but somehow it feels fitting that it's so haphazard, as everything you take from your visit boils down to how you feel and what you know about the men who lived and worked here, if plotting genocide can be considered work. The area is an ex-Khmer Rouge stronghold. It's a real frontier town with a Wild West vibe, and it's a legacy from its days as an inaccessible mountain area, which made it perfect for fugitives at the time. I'm on my way back from visiting Preah Vihear, which is a disputed hilltop temple complex on the Thai-Cambodia border. The ongoing conflict over the temple and the presence of armed forces in the area mean that the temple is not really on the main tourist trail. So in turn, even fewer make it to this more obscure and macabre site, which is easily visited en route to Siem Reap. For those who do make it to the stunning temples of Preah Vihear, an anti-pilgrimage to this muddy lakeside house of the Khmer Rouge leader Tar Mok, known as Brother Number 5, or the Butcher, and the place where Pol Pot was placed by his rival under house arrest until his death, holds obvious interest. Perhaps if this becomes a road more travelled, then one day the Cambodian government might license this site in the same way that they've licensed the killing fields to a part Japanese government-owned company. So the killing fields is making profit for a company and for a foreign government in a way that is quite hard to reconcile with. But for now, there's none of that here. There's no audio commentaries, there's no leaflets, and there's no English language signs. You just buy a simple $2 ticket from a dishevelled guard hanging around outside, and you're left to fend for yourself and mentally delve into the 1970s atrocities of Cambodia. With little or no information available, we discuss amongst ourselves as a group our bewilderment at the concept of genocide, and we speak about the sombre nature of the history of this country and the unfathomable pain that ordinary Cambodians suffered, and our own powerlessness in the face of such crimes, perhaps saying some of the same things that we might be saying today about Gaza, or thinking about that type of current political problem. But for some reason, at the time, I come back to wondering about the tiny, insignificant detail about the shoes. I desperately want to ask somebody if these are the original floor tiles. Are my bare feet making contact with the same floor that the bare feet of one of the most evil men in history made contact with? I later find out that the tiles are original, and they're the only things not to have been looted from the house. And somehow this small human detail is what really haunts me the most. So that's the piece I wrote after I'd been to Pol Pot's house. But I do want to just add, to not leave it on a sombre note, that it does pain me to talk about Cambodia in the context of its genocide and its murderous past. It's got so much more to offer than just that type of tourism. And I don't want to exacerbate the notion that this defines it. I wish I had more time to talk to you about what a gentle and warm country it is, and about all the joys that you can have by visiting Cambodia. The serenity of taking a yoga class at sunset overlooking one of the temples, the hedonism of partying in Sihanoukville, which is the beach resort of the country, or just shopping in Phnom Penh's boutiques and cute streets. There's a particular street 241, which is all just lovely little shops, lovely little cafes, a beautiful French bakery, not unlike the place we're standing today, but somewhere that's got obviously guaranteed hot and sunny weather all year round, unlike Vancouver. So I just hope that for those of you, and that's most of you, that haven't actually gone to Cambodia in the past, that you will get to experience some of those things in the future. So thank you.
Oh wow, it's a lot taller. Thank you so much. That's great. And you know what's interesting is yesterday on BBC News, the final two generals of the Pol Pot regime are on trial. It's taken years. Since 1979, they were detained, and finally they're coming to trial, right? So, Jai, perfect timing that you spoke about this. Thank you so much. Okay, we've got a couple more readings, and then we're going to have a Q&A, and that will take us to the end. Speaking of Cambodia, I know Jai was just talking about Cambodia. My next piece is about Cambodia, and it's called Blank Identity. It's one of my chapters in my book. And you know, what's really nice about traveling is that you can just be a nobody. Nobody needs to know your name. Nobody needs to know what you do in Vancouver or wherever you're living. You can just be this nameless person, and you can meet people, and then they befriend you, and then you move on to some other people. And it's great. And what's wonderful and liberating about that is that you don't have to be tied to a lot of the things that weigh us down here in our society. I like that about traveling. And when I was in Cambodia, I was actually in an accident. I was in a pedicab accident. You know what a pedicab is? It's one of those tricycles with the carriage in the back, and so I got into this accident during this horrible rainstorm, and this woman came and rescued me and brought me into her home and bandaged me up, and that's what my story's about. And I think this and so many stories throughout my book are so inspirational. Like, people who don't care about who I am or where I'm from welcome me into their home, and that's a wonderful gift of love that you can get from a stranger. It's called Blank Identity. I was coming back by a rickety pedicab. I was parched because I hadn't had a drink of water in several hours. Then disaster began to slowly unfold. First, the rain, light, soft, refreshing dabs of moisture in the beginning, and then heavier, frantic drops. The pedicab driver scanned the darkening clouds and sped up his pedaling along the uneven road. In his haste, he turned too quickly and missed a gigantic pothole that threw us both into the mud. I skidded across the pavement with my palms out until I came to a full stop. A large flap of skin from my hand waved in the wind. I painfully discarded it. My head throbbed. I wiped my forehead. The wetness was not sweat, but blood. Then I saw the real damage. The rickshaw was on its side like a fallen horse, its steel wheel tick-ticking away to a slow stop. The driver tried to resurrect it, but the wheel was bent. Then thunder and gusty winds. A tropical storm was coming. The heavens poured down, and soon puddles morphed into rivers down the road. The rain came down so hard that the drops jumped back up, soaking my clothes and backpack. Everything weighed me down as I trudged down the street. I shielded my eyes from the pelting drops for several minutes. The driver was nowhere to be seen, and neither was the pedicab. I couldn't duck in anywhere. People had closed up shops, and the streets were deserted. I pounded on a door, but all I saw at the window were darting eyes, and then the curtains. I staggered down the street for several minutes, feeling absolutely miserable. The roads remained empty. With my head bent, I made my way, as if in the dark, to a large tree and crouched underneath it. Wrapping my arms around my knees, I hunkered down, my body shielding my face. I waited for the storm to pass. Touch. A hand appeared. I raised my face a little, the drops stinging my skin. I squinted. Someone was pulling me down a narrow alleyway, then through a wooden doorway with only the person's sandals ahead of me. I staggered aimlessly, the woman's steady hand guiding me through the storm. I had to unlatch the hook, and the wind jerked the door open. My eyes adjusted to the darkness in the room. A little boy sat cross-legged in the corner. The woman whispered to the little boy, who immediately left, and then came back a moment later with a hand towel moistened with warm water. She dabbed it on my forehead, then showed me the pinkness at the tip. I had been bleeding. She then patted my scraped palms as I stood there unmoving. yet moved by her kindness. The whole time she cared for my wounds, she didn't speak, not a word. She stood before me and hesitated for a second. Then she disappeared and reemerged with a towel and some fresh dry clothes for me to change into. She filled a small teacup with hot water from the black kettle, and I drank one cup right after the other. My thirst quenched and my body dried and warm, I finally relaxed in my new clothes. The woman was now across the room ironing. Who was she? Her clothes were very plain, her house even plainer. Blank walls and a large table with only 2 chairs, enough to accommodate herself and one other person. Was she married? I tried to introduce myself, tell her my name, but she paid no heed. She only nodded in my general direction. She kept ironing. Every once in a while, she refilled my teacup, then went back to her ironing. This was so strange. Not once did she raise an eyebrow about my cuts and scrapes, nor did she ask me for my name, my race, or my background. To be honest, I felt relief. To be a nobody comforted me. I wouldn't need to explain my identity, my race, my marital status, my job, my existence. I felt so free. I wasn't tied to anyone. I didn't have to answer to anyone else. Sometimes people would ask me where I was from, and they weren't satisfied with my answer until I revealed my ethnic culture. Where are you from? Canada. No, really. Where are you from? I'm from Canada. But you look... Yeah, my parents are from China. Ah, okay. Then the conversation could continue. I get this all the time. People are often defined by their partner, work status, and family. I once visited my father's village in Guangzhou province, a village of about 200 people. When I introduced myself, the villagers gawked at me in confusion. Who is this well-fed Asian person with a funny accent, and what was she doing in this backwater village? It was only when I wrote the Chinese character of my family name in the sand and repeatedly uttered my father's name that they welcomed me. "Nine Jones' second daughter is here," someone yelled to a farmer out in the field. He then hollered that same message to the next field and to the next, until my father's relative in the far distance ran in to greet me. From then on, I was referred to as Nine Jones' second daughter. No one asked me for my name. It wasn't necessary. I was defined by my relationship to my father. And for many years, when I was living in China, I realized my identity was always tied to somebody or something. I was tied to my company who sponsored my working visa. I was Christoph's live-in girlfriend. I couldn't go anywhere without other expatriates asking where I was from and my ties to the foreign community. So when Christoph and I split up, I felt my identity was stripped from me. I believed my ties to him and the expat community created my identity. And amazingly enough, even months after the breakup, I still felt the power of my ties to him. The rain had finally stopped, and when the sun came out, the streets of Phnom Penh glistened for several minutes before it was dry again. It was hard to believe that such a heavy storm had just passed through. The woman finished ironing and rested beside me with a teacup nestled in her palm. We sat in comfortable silence as we gazed outside, watching the streets come alive again. Perhaps she was thinking the same thing I was, that we weren't that different from each other, human beings in need of a little company. Maybe she shared the same ideas, that we were not defined by man, culture, race, or even a political regime. I was a person just like her, and that the one commonality we shared was being at the same place at the same time. It was these small acts of generosity throughout my trip that showed me how people were bound together, that moved along my suffering heart to peace. The sky darkened and the rain started again, the pitter-patter echoing once more on the roof. The woman poured another cup of tea for me, and I smiled my thank you to her. She nodded. After all, we were just 2 women drinking tea in a small wooden laundry shop, wondering if the rain would stop soon, and at the same time, not caring if it did. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to introduce you to a really cool guy named Henry Lee. Come on up, Henry. I got to tell you something really cool. Can I tell this story? Okay.
Because I've already said it to a couple
Yeah.
people right now.
So I met Henry on Twitter again. Yes, I stalk people on Twitter. Met Henry on Twitter. Loved the fact that he was from Vancouver. Loved the fact that he's traveled all over. Lived in Germany. lived in Chile, like just lived all over. And I just thought, wow, I would love for this guy to come and read. So we met on Sunday here at this cafe. And we sat down and we just started chatting. And he's like, oh, you know what? I used to go to this church down the street. And I'm like, that is my church. And we both looked at each other. I was like, did you go to that church in the 80s? Yes. And it turns out that Henry was my childhood friend at this church. And we looked at each other in awe, wasn't it? Just like, oh my God. Like, and yeah, like, and I was like, your sister's name is Shirley. And he's like, your sister's name is Sharon. Oh my God. So isn't it wonderful, the serendipity nature of this world, that we can come together and be back together after all these years at a reading, you know, so almost 35 years later. So let's give it up for Henry, who is going to be sharing his piece about Chile. So, great.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Based on that story, you can come to one of two conclusions. Twitter is really useful, or Twitter is really scary. But it is interesting how we came back in contact with each other after being out of contact for over 3 decades. It's really kind of amazing. It also tells you something about how small this world really is, and to some extent how small Vancouver can be as well. It's in a good way, in a good way. Thank you for the introduction, Debbie. Thank you for being here. And since I'm talking to you about Chile, I want to say, muy buenas tardes a todos los presentes y gracias de corazón por ofrecerme nuevamente la oportunidad de participar en la celebración del libro nuevo de Debbie Wong. Thank God for Google Translate. And I know it's a hot room, but I think I have your attention now. But in all, basically what I've said here is a big thank you to everyone who's here today in support of Debbie's new book. And then the launch of her book here in Vancouver. She, Jai, and Adelina have mentioned, the reasons why people travel, the motivations that people have to travel. Maybe it's a curiosity about a certain place. For some, it's about a transition, and I'm going to talk about, for me, a transition. And in some extent, it could be described as a midlife crisis. So instead of buying a yacht or a Maserati, I traveled around the world. Not bad. Not a bad trade-off. I ended up in Chile as an astronomer. So I was an astronomer for over 15 years. And one of the avenues that led me to astronomy was my studying physics here in Vancouver. And in some respects, I never thought that I'd ever leave Vancouver, ever leave British Columbia. And it's easy to think that, given the weather that we have now, despite what we may think of winters here, the summers, and when the sun comes out, it makes it almost all worthwhile. So it's easy to think about the fact that it's kind of hard to leave. It's just really hard to get that emotional aspect out of your system in a way, or to be torn away from that emotional love of that mountains, of the view. But part of that journey that I took me to Toronto, the hated city of Toronto. But I'm very glad that I got to go to Toronto, because it allowed me to see a very different part of this country. And I had the opportunity to meet a different set of people in our own country, an opportunity that perhaps few other people may not have. And I was very fortunate to have that opportunity. And that led me on a road once I got to Toronto. And at that point, in my training as a scientist, as an astronomer, being allowed to go to Germany, being allowed to go to Italy, being allowed to go to South America for work, the conversation with my friends and family, so what are you going to do next week? Well, I'm going to Chile. What are you doing in Chile? I'm going to go to work. Yeah, right, you're going to work. You're not going to work in Chile? Well, actually, I am. I'm going to go to a telescope. There are a bunch of telescopes in Chile, and that's one of 2 sites in the world where you can build telescopes at possibly the best locations, the best sites in the world to build telescopes. The other location is Hawaii. So where are you going in the month's time? I'm going to Hawaii. You're going to work. You're going to work in Hawaii this time. Yes, I'm actually going to go to work in Hawaii, and then after that, I'm going to lie on a beach for a couple of days. But all these steps along the way allowed me, as my journey as an astronomer, not only to do different things about asking different kinds of questions, but at least personally, I was able to travel because of my time as an astronomer. What I'm going to talk about is the end of my time as an astronomer and the end of my time in Chile and what would come along next. So this story takes place at the end of 2011 in the middle of a desert called the Atacama Desert in north central Chile. To places in mind, if you know the geography of South America or of Chile, Santiago, the capital, is located about halfway down the country, which is basically a north-south country, which actually kind of similar to Canada. Canada is very much an east-west country. Chile is very much a north-south country. The city of La Serena, where I lived for 5 years, is an hour north by plane from Santiago to Chile. So this setting takes place in the middle of the desert, feeling like I'm in the middle of nowhere, which really is the case. I'm in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a desert, and I'm watching the sun rise in Chile for the final time. The morning creeps gently forward, up and over the desert sky. Sounds? What sounds? What scarce sounds there are, they pierce the silence with soft whistles and drawn-out wails. Alternating light and dark horizontal streamers, known also as the rays of God, mark the first light of dawn. Small clumps break loose as the overnight shroud of valley fog pulls back slowly from view. The sun climbs higher, the shadows grow shorter, the cotton patch dissolves. It isn't long until a spectacular sight is revealed. This is what you get from a height of 7,500 feet above sea level. Dry riverbeds twist and sweep and stretch along canyon floors. Cactus and desert shrub carpets the surrounding hills in faded greens and dusty browns. To the east rise the jagged rocky teeth capped with white frosting, fixing the location of the Andes along the Chilean spine. In this desolate and isolated part of the world, I've often wondered about the few brave souls who make this place a home. They're prospectors, miners, even farmers, all of whom carry their burden for financial endeavor. People have been digging around in these parts for centuries, whether it's plant, mineral, or some kind of monetary pay dirt. But there's another human enterprise with a different set of rewards, a quest that asks questions on a far different scale. How do planets take shape? How do stars form? How are galaxies assembled? Is there life elsewhere in the universe? These issues occupy astronomers from around the world. Many astronomers go up onto mountains just like this one, onto the summit of Cerro Tololo, peering up into the skies. The telescopes point straight up, reaching out like outstretched hands, wanting more. I've been coming here since 1995. I've never gotten bored of the Chilean sunrises, impressive in the daily entrance over the tall Andes Mountains. I've never gotten bored of the Chilean sunsets, providing, as always, some measure of peace in the daily exit over the waters of the Pacific. And so, I've witnessed hundreds of Chilean sunrises over the years. But today, the sunrise today stands out from the rest. Today, I'm leaving this mountain for the final time. Soon, I'll leave Chile, my residence of 5 years. Soon, I'll leave behind astronomy, 15 years in the making. I'm fortunate I recognized the change that was coming in my life, all the signs that were present, even though trying to stick around in what I was doing was undoubtedly the safer choice. Any despair that I had about leaving astronomy has now transformed into something that resembles kind of like relief. I have no regrets about astronomy. Other people will take my place. It's time for something new. I have a new journey now to take on. 1 full year around the world. I'm okay with jumping into the unknown. I get to ask different kinds of questions, even if I receive few answers in reply. I'm reminded once again that the journey itself will be the most important thing. Some furry four-legged creatures have arrived to greet the sunrise here on the summit of Cerro Tololo. A scruffy mountain goat moseys up, lifts his head, sniffs around, and trying to gauge my own morning mood. 3 desert foxes, about the size of small dogs, have also joined the party. But they all leave disappointed. I have nothing for their attempts to beg for food. It all sounds strange, but this is, in fact, a very fitting way for me to say goodbye to Chile. But a goodbye to the old implies that there must be a hello to something new. Well, what's it going to be? What am I going to be? Recovering astronomer, language collector, aspiring writer, enthusiastic traveler, passionate photographer. We all are, in fact, the same under the same sky. Thank you.
What a great turnout. I was just telling my sister Sharon over there, by the way, in case you haven't heard, we're all kind of loud, me and my 2 sisters. I was just telling Sharon earlier this week, I was like, well, I think we're going to probably get about 30 people. We have almost 50 people. Like, unbelievable. Way to go, Vancouver. Woo, woo, woo. And what a turnout. This is great. So I'm really appreciative of that. And actually, I have to call out one person here in this room that has been so helpful, and that's Paula Ayer, who's right there. And she's there in the blue in case you can't see her. But this is my editor. Actually, I got 2 editors. I wrote my book. It took me so long to write it. And then I had one of my teachers from this memoir writing class. He was also one of my editors. And then I had Paula here in Vancouver, edit my book, and she's been fantastic. And it took us months, right? But really, really helpful. She was good. She was like, Debbie, in chapter 2, that character doesn't seem to fit with chapter 5 there. Like, just really, really good. And yeah, very helpful. And so if you ever need an editor, very good. Anyway, I don't mean to steal the limelight here. Sorry? Yes, she's very good. We got some fans here already.
Okay, I'm Jenny. I'm an old friend of Debbie's. I've known Debbie for a really long time, or I thought I'd known her for a long time, but I think there's a lot of people in this room tonight who've known her for a lot longer than me. I've also had the privilege of traveling with Debbie a few times, and it's a wonderful experience, and for many reasons. It's hilarious to travel with Debbie, but she's also got an incredible warmth and also an insight into people that is quite unusual. So I found on my travels with Debbie, she had a real way with people, and it would sort of get us into people's homes and then end up in funny conversations with people. And the sort of, she always has a way of kind of bringing out the best in people and a natural warmth. And also she would often assume the best about people in sort of tricky situations, which was a big lesson for me that I still think about her when I'm traveling in new places. And I also, for those of you who haven't read the book, it's a great book. It's a great read. It's for sale tonight over here on this table. I highly recommend it for those of you who haven't read it. And available on Amazon and Kindle. So I was going to ask Debbie a question or two, but we wanted to hear from some of you as well. So please feel free to put your hand up if you have any questions for her. So Debbie first told me that she was going to write a book in 1999, so 15 years ago. Yeah. And because I've known Debbie throughout this process, what I'm interested in knowing is how the process of memoir writing changed as time went on. So presumably when you sat down to write the book, the trip was fairly fresh, the memories were fairly fresh. But over the decade that it took to write the book, how did the memories change? How did the process change? How did it happen?
Good. Yeah, it's 15 years in the making. It took me 10 years to write my book, and including 2 editors. One of them, as you know, is in the room here. And also, it also sat in my drawer for a couple of years, and then another 2 years of working with a designer to design my book, and also social media. But in answer to your question, Jenny, which I think is a good one, is I never planned to write the book. I just went traveling, and I was pretty messed up. And by the time I moved to New York, I was pretty lonely there. I was really kind of messed up my first year. I didn't know anybody, and I wanted to get back into some normal routine. And apart from a distant cousin in Queens, I really didn't know anybody. So that first year was really hard. And I spent a lot of time thinking and wondering. And I remember telling my dad, I was like, Dad, I'm just going to do this for 1 year. And sure enough, I'm still there. And I actually wanted to come back a few years ago. And I even put in a transfer to move back to Vancouver. And then 2 weeks later, I met my husband. I mean, it's just so funny how life turns out. But yeah, the process of memoir writing is funny, because I think when I first started to entertain the idea of writing this down, it was in around 2000. I was taking a memoir writing class, and it started off as a short story, and then it became this like big, much bigger epic tale. And I think what was interesting was that my perspective back then has changed. I think when I first started writing it, it was more like, oh, this is what I did, and oh, wasn't that funny that I got arrested in Tibet, and I had this accident in Cambodia. And then as I was writing this over the years, I thought, I need to go a little bit deeper and understand why I was so afraid to be alone, why I was in a relationship that I had no business being in. So it took a while. It took years of really looking at, the underlying reasons for why that had happened. And traveling is great because it's a bit distracting. You're meeting all these like fabulous people. You're seeing amazing things. But they also challenge you. I met people who had suffered far worse than me, and yet they kept going. And that inspired me. And I remembered this over the years as I was writing my book. I also think the process of healing is very different for everyone. I think I didn't really recover from that until probably about 2005. And, that was when I put my book in a drawer, and I didn't touch it for 2 years. Because I think the most painful part of my books, I just couldn't write. And it took some time before I could explore it again and heal from that, before I could really fully write my book. And that's why it took as long as it did. And the last thing I want to say is that I think when I read my book now, I'm like, who is this person? Like this, and could I be this brave, to travel around the world? And I think it's in all of us, I think traveling can really change who you are. I think I was a very different person back then, and I feel really happy that I've changed from that. I don't regret anything in my life. I made poor decisions. I've made a lot of mistakes, but I don't regret anything because I think I learned from that. So I hope I answered your question.
Okay. The other question I was going to ask before we see if anybody else has questions is what would you want your readers to get out of your book?
Good one. 2 things. One is, I wish someone sat me down in 1999 and said, you're going to be okay. I was really messed up because I think it was a bit complicated, the breakup, and, this was someone I was with in a foreign country, and so I was pretty messed up. And I wish someone, kind of inspired me to move forward, and, but I did. I met people along the way that helped do that. And so what I would love for people to get out of the book is that I hope that the stories that you read in my book will inspire you to, rediscover a strength in you that maybe you never had, that you could also find, something in you that maybe you never really knew before. And the second thing is that even though you've never been to Tibet or Cambodia, that you could be an armchair traveler and read it and go, wow, I would love to go there. We just did an event in New York last month. And one of the best things that came out of that event was just people that came up to me later and said, wow, I never knew that you could travel alone like this. Or wow, I never knew you could, travel to these far-flung locales. And it was fabulous to be able to plant that seed in people to go, you know what, I would like to travel. I'd like to write as well. So those are the two goals that I have for releasing my book.
Thank you. So, does anybody in the audience have any questions for Debbie? Oh, okay. I don't think I can stretch. Well, actually, I can try. I'll try and stretch back here. No, I can't. You shout it out.
I just want to piggyback onto what Lee said about. I was just curious. I haven't read the book. Got 3 copies. And I wanted to. I had 1,000 questions if I'd read it prior, but I'm just curious about the writing of it. And would you say it's written with an introspection as you wrote it that maybe you just couldn't have approached it the same way if you tried 5 years ago? Yeah. I wonder if that factored into it. I believe a book will come when it's finished.
So you're asking if she wrote it with more introspection because more time had gone by than if she...
Maturity, it was just the right time you put that into it, maybe more so than you would have at the age.
Right.
That's Lisa, by the way, whom I haven't seen in 26 years. Hello. That's a good question. I couldn't have finished the book even 5 years ago. I definitely couldn't have finished the book 10 years ago. So I think writing is an evolutionary process of where you are in your life and your perspective and also your maturity, When I was in New York, I was in New York, and I'm single for a really long time too, because I didn't want to be in a relationship. I think I was really afraid, and there was that vulnerability that I felt to open up my heart again to somebody. And I actually met my husband around 4.5 years ago, and he actually really helped me heal again and feel that I could open my heart to somebody, and that helped me finish my book. I actually dedicated my book to him. He's not here tonight, unfortunately. He's in New York. So in answer to your question, Lisa, I think it really depends on where you are. I think if you're a writer, you need to be so open to all possibilities, and that's why I think a lot of people may not finish what they're writing, because I think you really need to go deep sometimes and really ask a lot of tough questions and be able to answer them.
One is that it's like a job, and you should sit and write 1,000 words a day, have a schedule, start at 10, whatever it might be for you. And the other is that writing is like an inspiration, and you have to wait for that moment to strike. And I know that if you do that, sometimes the moment of inspiration doesn't strike for like 2 months and you don't get a paycheck or whatever. So I just wondered how you managed to write a whole book, whether you took the inspiration route or the perspiration route.
Did everyone hear that question? Yeah? Okay. It took me 10 years to write the book. But I have to say, and I say this to all writers, you need to join a writing group because they push you. So in 2000, I took a memoir writing class. And from that class, I befriended about 5 other writers. And they were all writing these amazing stories about their lives. And we met every 2 weeks to exchange chapters. And we were brutal with each other. Like, that's not going to work. Or, oh, wow, you should do this. So we did that for 2 years, and I was able to write my first draft, and it was a little shaky. And then I hired an editor who was actually our teacher to help me through that, and we did a global read where we looked at character development and we looked at plot and things like that. But I was also living in New York and surrounded by cultural activities and other writers, so that was very inspiring for me. I also felt like along the way, I also had a lot of time. I was single then. So every weekend, I would plant myself in Starbucks and write for, several hours. I also took little trips to upstate New York and went away for the weekend and write for a couple days. And it was just really nice. I don't think I can do that now. So yeah, a little bit of inspiration, a little bit of perspiration. I always carried a little notebook with me or little cocktail napkins, and I would write, jot some things down. But yeah, that process was brutal. It took a while, but I think the one thing that really helped propel me to finish it was I had other writer friends, and we often swapped and shared feedback with each other.
Any other questions? So the question was, what would be what would be the worst mistakes you've made?
Okay, don't go to Tibet with an expired visa. That's just not cool. Yeah, and this is in my book. I'm not going to give away too much, but yeah, if you're going to a country like China, which Tibet falls under China now. Yeah, make sure your visas are in check. I was working in China at the time, and I had a working visa, and I thought I could, nobody would notice that my visa was expiring when I was in Tibet. And I was in Tibet a little bit longer than I should, and I remembered in the middle of Tibet, in the middle of nowhere, the police caught a hold of that and threatened to throw me in jail, and it was brutal. I'm not going to give it away. You'll have to read about what I had to do. But yeah, it's a little lesson to learn, which is make sure you have your visas and your papers in order. It's never happened again, by the way.
Where is next on your bucket list?
Oh, wow. I've been all over the world except for Africa and South America. And in about 2.5 weeks, my husband and I are going to go to Argentina. We're so thrilled about going. I don't speak any Spanish, but my husband speaks Portuguese and Spanish, so I think we'll be good. Have any of you been to South America? Oh, great. Would love to pick your brain about it later. I think that's next on my place to go. And I would love to go back to Tibet one day, but given how much I blog and write about this, I'm not sure they'll let me back in.
Any other questions? Are you writing another book?
Oh God, no. I think that took me 10 years to write, and thank you. I write. I still continue to write. I have a blog, and I'm currently working on a project right now called 52 Travel Stories, and I write every Saturday, just a little piece. And if you're interested, you can go onto my website and you can sign up for my blog. But in answer to your question, I think I would like to maybe write my second book when I'm a bit older. I think I just got a lot going on right now, and with work and my new stepdaughter. But thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody. Thanks, Debbie. And I'll introduce the last reading of the night. Debbie's last reading is one of my favorite passages from the book. And it also will explain to everyone how the book got its name. So I'll hand it over to Debbie. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Home stretch, guys. One last thing. By the way, thanks to Jenny, who did a fabulous Q&A moderating here. So thank you so much, Jenny. Whee! Jenny, in February, flew out to New York and helped me with my book launch. And that was fantastic. I mean, we had over 115 people show up at the Tibet House, and Jenny was absolutely instrumental. So thank you. And here she is at my second book launch. I wanted to do one last reading, and then we're done for the evening. Perhaps some of you are thinking, well, why is this called The Same Sky? And I'd like to share with you a passage from my book. It's actually the end of my book, and it's an interesting piece because it's a piece about my mother, actually, and my grandmother. This is my mother's mother, and this piece is about how my mother has gone through so much when she was growing up in China, and how that had an indelible imprint in my mind about what it was like growing up. And I think that when you think about where we go in life, we come across people, and there's that universal pull that we gravitate towards other travelers, and these universal themes of like love and grief and anger, all of that bring us together. And you don't have to be from Canada, you don't have to be from the States to really understand each other. You could be from all over the world, and we all kind of share that similar common human universal ground. So this next piece talks a little bit about how how my mom, when we were growing up, she would share a little bit about her past and what brought us together, and what are some of those common themes that that enlighten us and inspire us. I looked up at the blueness overhead, streaked with fiery orange, and wondered if my mother was staring up at the sky too. Perhaps at that moment she was in her garden, her pride and joy, gazing up at the Vancouver sky as she moved from the bok choy section to the green onions. I could imagine her now, bending down, carefully massaging the dirt, and then standing up to survey the beautiful work, her eyes blank and infinite. One time, when I was 7 years old, helping my mother pull weeds from her garden, I had asked questions about China and her village for the first time. My mother, who had lived in Guangdong province all her life before immigrating to Canada in 1965, told me that everything was always different in another country: the food, the air, the people. Well, what about the sky? I asked. My mother shook her head, the dark permed curls bouncing for a second. She gave me an odd look. No, it looks the same. Sun, the clouds, Genjinia. It follows you wherever you go. What you see above reminds you of what you should remember, and they stay with you. I was confused. What follows you? Like what? My squeaky voice questioned. But my mother's hardened face just turned away. Was she thinking about her old life in China, or the people she left behind? Maybe she was thinking about her own mother who died when she was only 5 years old. Ghosts, she finally said. People I used to know. Like your mother? I asked. She nodded and then turned her back to me as I continued to yank the weeds out with my small fists. I was braver back then to ask such a question. It had been a silent rule around the house that we were never to discuss Grandma unless our mother brought it up first, which wasn't often. She never liked to talk about the plight of our grandmother, and it was only our father who filled in the gaps of the story. For days, the entire village was afraid as story after story of the communists coming to clean house filtered through the tiny provincial pocket of Guangdong. It was 1949, after the Kuomintang was defeated. They had deserted their posts and fled to Taiwan. Communist troops were ordered to establish command at every village, town, and city. My grandmother, being one of the wealthiest women in the village, was afraid for her life. After all, she was alone. Her husband was in Hong Kong starting up an herbal business and was sending money back to her on a monthly basis. In the meantime, she had to sit tight. Then one morning, she brought my mother and my Uncle Peter to the shores of the river. Crying and singing a lullaby to soothe her children, my grandmother stuffed money into their tiny pockets. She disappeared among the sugarcane stalks, and on the other side of them waded out into the water, the strong current taking her frail body downstream. The two children observed her black head bobbing up and down until it was a dot in the distance. My mother didn't know how long she had waited. It was only until fishermen noticed two small children on the shore, steadfast, eyes yearning, waiting for someone who would never come back. One day tumbled into the next until Grandma's body washed up on the shore of the next village. Just clothes, bones, and her ring remained. The villagers took pity on my mother and her brother, and a neighbor who already had 6 children adopted them. A year later, they were sent to Hong Kong to live with their father. The communists never did come looking for my grandmother after all. But it was over, I reminded my mother during the rare times she talked about Grandma. She asked, then how do you account for the nightmares? Let me tell you what I see sometimes in my dreams. It had come in the form of darkness that crept up along the banks of the river where she and her brother had stood over 30 years ago. She eyed my grandmother's peaceful and graceful figure in the distance with the black cape that was her shadow. Then she disappeared into the sugarcane field, the tangling branches low enough to cover her face. Just a glimpse. These were the images she saw over and over again since that fateful day. Years later, in 1984, after moving to Hong Kong and then eventually to Canada after marrying my father, my mother went back to her village for the first time. She stood on the embankment and remembered everything: the current of the water, the gentle swaying of the sugar canes nearby, and the clear turquoise sky above her. After asking the other villagers, she soon discovered that her mother's burial site was only a few feet away from where she and her brother had stood on the shore. They hired men to dig up the bones and reburied my grandmother on a beautiful, peaceful spot alongside the mountain. After that, my mother's nightmares ceased. Like my mother, I faced my own ghosts and the fears of being alone. And like her, I didn't let the roots of my anger toward Christoph overrun me completely or let my pain massage my hope in people again. Now, at the end of my journey, I've arrived at peace. And the peace had come from going deep within and discovering that solace didn't come from physical places or even from another person granting you that peace. It was the kind of peace that's earned, inspired by those around me, like the Tibetans, Laotians, and Cambodians who experienced grief far deeper than mine and yet still carried on because they had to, as I must. Christoph's ghost had followed me through the Himalayan mountains in Tibet to the beaches of Thailand and the lonely temples in Laos. And while his ghost passed through me, I had met wonderful locals with their beautiful smiles and stories that distracted me, giving me a portal into their lives. They had given me a glimpse of life again, showed me that the world was bigger than I imagined, and that inspiration could be felt in the simplest of gestures. Despite the differences in language, culture, and food, we were all under the same sky, bound by the commonalities of the human spirit, kindness, grief, heartache, and hope that transcended any border, political regime, or cultural boundaries. At the heart of it all, we were the same. Thank you. Thank you. And I have to say thank you to my parents for sharing that story with us. They've been so wonderful and so strong in raising me and my two sisters. And if it weren't for my parents, we wouldn't be here. So I really want to give a shout out to my parents and for being so supportive. Thank you. So we've come to the end, and I have two things I want to say. First of all, I want to thank all of you for making the time to come here, and it's so wonderful that we've all come together and we have travel in common. And if you ever want to talk about traveling or writing or anything like that, I'm here for you. I would love to share my experiences with you. I also want to thank Henry, Jai, and Adelina for being such wonderful readers, and Jenny for moderating the panel. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. One last person I want to thank is Danny there in the back. I just met Danny a couple hours ago. And Holly, who is my childhood friend, and I haven't seen her again in 26 years. That's her husband, who has offered to graciously record this event for free. And we'll put it up on YouTube along with our other videos in the series. So thank you very much, Danny. Cool. And finally, let's not forget Hal. Hal has been awesome in opening up his cafe to us, and thank you so much for supporting him and purchasing his food and his drinks. We really appreciate that, and so thank you. Great. The last thing I have to say is, stick around. We've got there's some book signing if you're interested in getting the book or purchasing one of Henry's photos. We've got some promotional materials for you to look at. You're welcome to stick around and hang out with us. And so thanks again for coming. Really appreciate it. Thank you.